Okay, thanks, Jane. I'm just going to share the screen and put it on project. So the first thing I want to say on this is some of you who are on the steering group for Corn will have seen some of this, and there's some extra bits in the mix, but I know not everybody was able to be with us for our meeting between Christmas and the New Year, which we had live in the museum, one of the rare occasions that we actually got together. The other thing I should say from a caveat point of view is I'm speaking as a member of the sustainability group. I'm clearly not a member of the administration at West Northants Council, so I'm looking at this through the lens of the work that the sustainability group has done so far and where we have got to. And that's quite important in the context because there is no decision-making power fundamentally within the sustainability group. But I'll talk a little bit about how it's evolved from its original start point where we've got to now and how it tries to shape and influence. But fundamentally, it is an influencing group really within the council rather than a decision-making group. That's quite key, I think. Okay, so a little bit of context. So there's some timelines here that I think are really important for people to be aware of. Some of this might be familiar to you, some of it might not be. So the first key point was in the summer of 2021, West Northants Council made a redeclaration of a climate emergency. All of the previous legacy councils, with the exception of South Northants, had done so. South Northants had put a motion forward regarding climate, but I don't think it was officially a climate emergency. But fundamentally, all councils were on that same page at that time. The next phase really was a commitment to go for net zero, working under the umbrella of the UK 100, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And net zero in two timelines: net zero for the council's own emissions for 2030. That's in line with the UK 100 pledge, of which I believe there are something like 110 councils across the country that have now signed up to that. And they are multi-tiered. So some unitaries, some counties, some districts have signed that pledge. And the longer term, more challenging pledge is a net zero target of 2045 for the entire area. Now that is 5 years ahead of the current government legislation, which is 2050. But it's a big challenge, and I'm sure everybody's been watching the news from Scotland today with interest, noticing that there's now a lot of debate about timelines. And some councils, I was on a call the other day, some councils are also pushing their 2030 target a little bit further out. In one case, Somerset, because there was lack of clarity. In our case, 2030 is for the council's emissions, not for the wider area. It's still a big ask, but at the moment, the view is that it is potentially still attainable. Also in 2022, the administration decided that it was going to, rather than just focus on climate as a framework, it was going to use the UN 17 sustainability goals as its backdrop. And again, I won't labour that. I'll talk about it again in a moment in a little bit more detail. We then had a councillor from West Northants Council attend the very first UK 100 Leadership Academy. The council published its first baseline emissions report, which is quite critical because that gives us a very clear focus from council emissions of what that looks like and the sort of goals that we've got to try and work with, or the challenges that face us. That document is still available. And the plan is that will be reported upon in an annual sustainability report. Then in 2023, my group put forward a motion to try and give more of a role to the sustainability group fundamentally. And that was passed. There were a few very small tweaks made by the administration, but now what it fundamentally means is the sustainability group should, in theory, be able to shape and influence policy development across the council. It doesn't control it, and it doesn't necessarily hold the reins of all of it. But we're starting to see now different functions within the council coming to the sustainability group for review, for dialogue, which hopefully then shapes any output before it goes forward for decision making. And clearly, because we have a cabinet-based decision making process in West Northants, that's where all of the decisions are fundamentally made and sign off of policies and procedures and so on. Then we had an opportunity to go again on the UK 100 Leadership Academy, and I had the chance to go this time, which was extremely useful and very enlightening. And I wanted to make it my mission to make sure that any of the learning that took place over those 3 weekends didn't sit in isolation. And I've been actively through the sustainability group and other areas trying to bring all of that learning back into the council. And again, hopefully more of that will become more apparent when I talk through this in more detail. And then finally, as a result of that, in January of this year, the sustainability group agreed that we should have an overarching climate strategy. That is notwithstanding the fact that there are things going on that are sitting around this whole agenda. But what we lacked is an overarching view or an overarching perspective. And that work is now underway. Some of you will know that we have a lead officer, Martin Wilson, who works in the sustainability team. Unfortunately, Martin's not been too well. So Martin has been off sick for about 6 weeks. He's back now. He's back with us, which is great. But it's pushed our timelines down a little bit. But for clarification, what we hope is that we'll get it onto the council's forward plan. And hopefully we will get a climate strategy in draft form to go to cabinet around July. That's our ambition before the summer break. So the sustainability goals, most of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with them. But the very first thing that I did coming back from the Climate Academy workshop was to do a mapping exercise to try and use those 17 goals and say, what are we doing that aligns around climate on those issues? And how does it fit with other strategies that the council has put together or is evolving and working on? And you can see we have an anti-poverty strategy, which has been in place for some time now. And there are a number of the UN goals that align to that. We have a health and well-being strategy, which has produced and introduced our local area partnership formats. And there are a number of the UN goals that align to that. But my argument was trying to say that although there were things happening around climate, we didn't really have a strategy as such that was trying to pull all of those different strands together around the remainder of those particular goals. So this map was the first start point, really, to try to use as an argument to say we really ought to have something in the mix and use or create a framework that hangs everything together. I mentioned that the council produces an annual sustainability report. We had quite a lot of debate about where that sits in the grand scheme of things, and I think we've arrived at the conclusion that we should have an annual sustainability report, which will update not just on the anti-poverty strategy issues or the health and well-being strategy, but also on the longer term on any work that's going on around climate specifically. And as I say, that's one area that we didn't really want to disrupt and change the system completely. We'd only had one annual sustainability report, but we felt we should keep that process rolling at the moment. And clearly part of that document will also be an emissions update to report on where we've got to with those issues. Sorry for the slides being busy, but there's a lot to try and cram in to explain the thinking behind it. But the idea behind the climate strategy in its broad format will be to set direction and particularly make sure that we have alignment around all of the areas of work and activity that's going on. And I think that was one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that there are things going on, they're just not necessarily happening in that aligned way at the moment. So that's what the climate strategy will set out to hopefully do. So it will set direction, it will reflect activity going on, it will create alignment, and hopefully it will help us think about how we build this stuff into the culture of the council in its day-to-day activity. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that there is a group called the Net Zero Implementation Group, which is a group of officers that meet quarterly currently. And we are now hoping that we can try and get some airtime as a sustainability group within the context of that, that operational group. So that's very much an operational group working on all of the issues associated with net zero. So fundamentally, what our ambition will be is to have a strategy that's got a clear vision. We already have some very obvious big goals of the net zero for 2030 and for 2045. We probably need to be thinking about some sub-goals and some specific targets within that. But probably the main difference or the main focus of where we were before to where we are now is to try and build it around these things called the key strategies or key pillars. And these are as a direct result of the work that the UK 100 have done. And I will wave this. I know you're looking at the slides, but this is one of the key documents, which is available online. It's called the Handbook of Local Authority Net Zero Powers. And this became the basis of all of the learning that took place with UK 100. And it's effectively the Bible, the backbone of what responsibilities councils have currently got. It's fair to say that the view of UK 100 is they don't have enough, that it's not localized enough. And I think that's reflected very much in the introduction of this document itself. But nonetheless, what it does set out very clearly is that powers do already exist around those key areas identified there: energy, buildings, transport, waste, and nature. And that's both for the council's own operation, but also in the way that it can influence the rest of the area that it operates in. So that's the framework that the bulk of the strategy will have aligned around those core areas. One of the things that this document does not talk about, though, is it doesn't really talk about economy. And that's something that we are hopefully going to try and align within this document in some shape or form. There is quite a lot of regeneration activity going on, and we've been assured that that the underlying basis of a lot of the decision making that's going with that is aligned to net zero issues and climate issues. But one of the areas that probably isn't addressed is whether there's an opportunity for the proverbial green job label that comes up time and time again. So that we think there should be a sixth pillar fundamentally, which tries to harness some focus on economy. Now, across all of those areas, there clearly are going to be some threads that have to run all the way through all of them. And some of these are in place. Some of them are at different stages. So procurement, that's very much now part of the decision-making process. Whether it's sufficient, whether it could go further, whether it could be tougher is a whole different debate, but it is now in the mix. And certainly when the Cllr contract was procured, it was very much part of that decision-making process. Engagement, that's definitely in an area that we don't do enough of. We need to do more of, and I'll come on to that a bit later on. We are looking to try and do a mapping exercise. One of my beefs has always been, to be fair, that have we got enough resource to do what we need to try and do? And if you look at the sustainability team in isolation, you could quite easily argue that we don't. But I'm hoping, again, that within the strategy, we can look at a mapping exercise which shows us who we have in other departments and other functions and other areas of the council who have got at least some form of a net zero remit in the role that they're undertaking. Clearly, we need some governance, and I think our governance probably needs to be beefed up a little bit as well. As I mentioned, We now have a bit more emphasis around the role of the sustainability group. And Martin, who is the lead officer within our group now, is involved in sign-off processes to do with papers going to cabinet, and therefore has the opportunity to comment and give view. That probably needs to be stretched out in terms of time cycle. It's now probably a little bit too close to the actual event. So there's definitely some governance issues that we need to get to grips with. Communication links to engagement. Again, I think we need to be much better at that. And one of the key messages over the development weekends was how do you create immunization negative messages, because there is a growing, as we know, bandwidth of negative messages. We think there's an opportunity to be more creative and more proactive on positive messages rather than waiting for negative ones and not responding to them. And the final strand is training of officers and members. That's an area that at the moment is probably not had a lot of focus, but it definitely needs to be built into the strategy as we move forward. This is the busiest slide, I promise, but this slide is an attempt to show how certain activities are already taking place and how they align to those powers in place as the overarching strategy. This is not complete yet. It needs further work, as in it still has gaps, but it also needs more work on the red, amber, green process associated with it. So you can see that there are some areas, if I pick out one red that leaps out under nature, biodiversity net gain, most of you will know that legislation has changed now, and there is a requirement for a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain, ideally on the location of any development. But if not, there is a credit system that links to that where you can buy credits to still create net gain, but within our own area. We don't have a system at the moment for that, so that needs a lot of focus and work still. Some of the things that are in place, estate strategy, construction and maintenance plan, that's in place. That's got a focus on net zero and climate, but you can see there's a lot of amber, so there's a lot of work still to be done, and the stuff that's highlighted in black doesn't mean nothing's happening yet, but it's not quite clear probably where we're at with those things. But this is the big piece of work, really, is to A, find out what is going on, and B, try and pull all of those strands together in one place. This slide is to try and demonstrate what we hope broadly the structure of the strategy will look like. This is not an absolute. There's some very good examples of strategies out there that councils have already put in place. And, you know, one of the benefits of being involved in this UK 100 network has been building that network and getting to meet quite a lot of people. And my philosophy is always there's no need to go reinventing the wheel, and there's an awful lot of really good material out there. But broadly, this is, as I say, it won't be exactly this necessarily, but broadly, this is what the content or section structure will look like when it's finally in place. As I say, I'll talk on timelines again in a moment. These are freely available on other councils' websites, so I would suggest go have a look. The ones that leap out to me particularly are these three. North Somerset Council in particular is a pretty good one, and Wiltshire, and then also Cambridge City. And obviously, the strategy is one thing. What we actually need to go with the strategy will be the action plans that sit around it. And some of those are already in place because of some of the work that I've already indicated is already going on within the council. You'll have noticed, if you saw across those areas of activity, the local plan pretty much sits across all of those threads. So most of you will know that the new combined local plan draft under section 18 is now live for consultation. It's on the citizen space page for West Northants Council, and the closing date for comments is midnight on the 2nd of June. I'm flagging this in particular because this is a major opportunity to ensure that we have the policies in place that we really feel are appropriate for our area. The time span of this plan will be till 2041. What's my view? It's probably worth giving my view. I think there's some areas where we've moved forward. There are some areas where I still think we could be more challenging. But obviously, what we have to do is bear in mind the process that we've got to go through with an inspector. Inspectors always look for evidence. So I think that's going to be one of the key challenges on some of these areas. Some of you might have read recently about a challenge to a plan or a planning application in Oxfordshire District Council, I think it was, where they wanted to put in passive house standards. The inspector actually said, no, you can't put that in, but the High Court said, yes, you can. So there's increasing examples where there's more challenge coming forward. And I think that's been my message as the local plan has been put together, is let's put more emphasis on it. But this is a really important document. It's not the final version. There will be a further consultation towards the end of the year. But it's really important. I can only emphasize enough how important it is for people to take some time to have a look at it. And yes, it's a chunky piece of work, but I would say focus predominantly on the document which has the draft policies within it, which is in itself about 300 odd pages. But that's probably going to be a big message you'll keep hearing me say, because the more people that we get to comment and contribute on this, the better. Happy to take questions on that as well, if anybody's got any.
Probably just worth saying there, Jonathan, that Corn will aim to issue. I'm not saying it will be sort of perfect responses or anything like that, but picking out some key points that we think people might want to include if they do respond. I do totally understand it's a really very time-consuming exercise to properly review the consultation.
Yeah. It's time-consuming and very technical in a lot of places, but there is the opportunity on the website. You just have an email address, and I think encourage people, if they have a view. For instance, I encountered a gentleman the other evening who was very vociferous about solar on warehousing, one of the areas that we talked about a lot. We had a long conversation about the fact that the National Planning Policy Framework and building regs don't make it standard, and it should do, clearly. But nonetheless, I encouraged him to simply make that comment using the email, if you wish to, on the local plan. So I think that's what I would encourage people to do. Don't necessarily worry about getting bogged down in the massive detail. Use the simple email address if you've got comments that you want to make on it, because it's so important. This I've put in at the 11th hour because this happened today. UK 100 have joined forces with Mission Zero Coalition, which is led by Chris Skidmore. Some of you will know Chris Skidmore because he's the Conservative MP who is now not a Conservative MP. He stepped down and caused the by-election in Bristol. He was involved in the net zero team at government and got so angry and frustrated about the way things were going, he decided to leave. But I think this is quite interesting in terms of the shape that's now emerging, because this report has just come out today called Zero In, and it's trying to focus on how do we accelerate local climate action, particularly within local government. Within this document itself, there are those key actions that you can see set out there. So the focus on what local authorities should do, and again, a further push or plea for what central government needs to do in this midst. But what they've also introduced is a pledge for council leaders, cabinet members, councillors and candidates who are seeking election in the forthcoming round of local elections to make the pledge. And as you can see, one of the key pledges really is to try and deculture wars the climate agenda. We know that that's an underlying issue. We know that that's already bubbled over in a number of the by-elections. And what they're simply asking for is to try and focus back on basics. And actually within the work that we've tried to do as a sustainability group, I didn't mention specifically at the beginning, is cross-party. And it's a fairly balanced cross-party group, actually. There are 3 Conservatives, 2 Labour, 2 Lib Dem. That our mission really, all the way down through the thread and the conversations that we've been having, is obviously we don't have local elections this time round, but we do next May, has always been we want to create a strategy and a focus and a process and a governance system that should not be thrown away, ripped up and tossed out the window come May 2025 if the council make up changes. So we have that broad support. As you know, things change in councils, things have changed today. So, you know, that's going to be one of the things that I think we're going to have to keep working on to try and make sure that it isn't politicized. We really are focusing what needs to be done, and that hopefully we're all broadly aligned on the same page to try and create the right actions. So we can't unfortunately sign up to that pledge this time around because we're not up for election. But there are 10 regional mayor elections on the 2nd of May, and there's something like 2,800 councillor seats up for election. So those people are being encouraged to go down that route and sign up this pledge, basically. And then lastly, just to mention, there are so many pieces of work out there. It is like a minefield trying to find them all. And this is just a very small example. And one of the things that's been challenging for me is to try and do my best to share these with officers. All of the powers in place documents have been shared with cabinet members. And I would just say to everybody looking here, we will make sure you get these slides, so you'll have these reference documents to see and go find if you wish to. There is so much good material out there. The challenge is the alignment piece, I think, because you can be pulled in so many different directions fundamentally. But I think that the key thing to remember is there are other actions going on that have to take place, which will contribute. For instance, local nature recovery strategy is a legal requirement. We have an officer in place now. It's a full-time role. It's a permanent role. That will play very much into the nature strand of the key pillars here. I know that you are going to be talking tree strategy at the next session. And from the outline work that I've seen of that, that's looking really positive and really constructive. And I think that will make a really major contribution into the mix as well. So there are some really useful things coming through. As always, within local authority, it's speed is the challenge, and the resource that sits behind it, really. But I hope I'm not going to go on much longer than that. I hope that's given everybody a bit of a flavour of where things are at. I'm sorry that it's a little bit more of watch this space because we're not quite there yet, but I feel like we are pointing certainly in the right direction now. Perhaps we weren't for a while. And I'll stop share so that we can deal with any questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was really interesting. Can I just say, before we start on questions from other people, I really liked the busy slide. I have to say, I think classifying things and grouping them together is an essential foundation for being able to do anything. And I should be studying that slide in detail later. So thank you.
I was going to say, Jane, there are gaps in there, and I think that's
I'm sure.
where.
But that's the whole point of doing that sort of exercise, that you highlight where you've got gaps and even potentially duplications, so that you can fill things. And coming back to what you said about on that very last slide, where you were saying that, you know, it's possible to get pulled in lots of different directions. And that's why you have a strategy, isn't it? So if you feel that you are being conflicted, you can go back to the strategy and say, actually, what did we say we were going to do? So I think it's absolutely invaluable.
Yeah.
There's just one comment from David Garlick into the group, which I'm sorry, you probably made it a while ago, David, and it passed me by a little bit when it was the slide, and then I thought, well, I will just wait till the end. But I think this is when you were talking about the different threads that sort of cut across, and one of those was resource. And what David said was that a volunteer group like this one could potentially be part of the
Yeah.
resource.
Well,
And
that
I,
fits
yeah,
that that fits into the point that I was going to build on, and I neglected to, around engagement. Because one of the things that, again, we have broadly agreed is that we think groups like this, and David's group that he has also in the town, and other groups, should be involved in an engagement process with this work as it evolves before it goes out to a consultation. So not exactly co-production, but certainly the opportunity for people to contribute views and ideas. And that's certainly something that, although it might not appear that it's on the plan, that is definitely something we've agreed that we should need to do. And I'm hoping that by the time, or before we get to the point where we've got a draft version, we might have a draft 1 and a draft 2, but by the time we've got a draft 1, I hope that we've got a foundation that we can involve local groups, like yours, like others, to come together and contribute and give views and ideas to it.
yeah, absolutely. It's foolish not to, because you've got people and groups that are, genuine experts in some areas. I think you've got, so John Crick is on this call. His group Living Streets knows an awful lot about active travel. Why not tap into that knowledge rather than the council having to work on it themselves? When, as you say, there's so much stuff out there, you've got limited capacity. You need to tap into other people's resources where you possibly can.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
One thing that I thought strategy need is some sort of key targets and timeline as for achieving those targets, which wasn't on your slides there, but
it was on the vision slide, Mick. So
right.
that we've got these two big, hairy, audacious goals, the 2030 and the 2045. But a subset of that, it definitely needs more targets and more sub goals. And they're not there yet. I agree with you, but they definitely need to be part of that thinking.
Yeah.
As with every good project, you need those sort of milestones that you aim for in the shorter term, aren't there? Emmy.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the culture. You mentioned the culture in the council, really, and how you're feeling about. I know it's early stages and you're yet to put it through in July, but sometimes these things are seen as the least important when it's actually the most important. And you mentioned about that a lot about the sort of misinformation and the pledge and so forth. I suppose I'm curious about the process you felt so far within that culture. And you mentioned how things have changed today and whether you think that could be somehow positive where this is concerned. Anything about that, really?
Yeah. So I think I mean, I always caveat this because clearly I'm not in administration. I'm an opposition councillor, so my lens will definitely be different, I'm sure. But I think the reality is that it's a massive beast coming together, the forming of all of these different councils. And I don't think it was underestimated, but I think we're still living through the reality of what that is like, bringing all of those different councils together. We heard people telling us from other unitaries that it's a 10-year journey, for instance. And I think that's probably pretty realistic, actually. I think, to expect us to be moving much faster than that is probably not likely. We had COVID in the mix, so that's not the excuse, but it definitely became a focus and obviously a very important distraction for all of the councils during that transition year. What I mean by culture specifically is that thing about it's not part of our DNA yet, really. It isn't talked about enough, climate and impact of climate. We still have some reports that are produced by officers, and you look at the climate impact section, which is a standard part of it, and they're still not necessarily really picking up all of those key elements around really what is climate impact and what isn't. And I think that's going to come from education and training. Part of the challenge I think we've got is resource, which means trying to train and develop people when it's not necessarily a stable platform that you're working with. You know, we still do have temporary staff in the mix in some areas. Planning in particular has been through the wars. It's settling a bit, but it's still probably not quite there yet. So I think that's one of the ways that we're going to have to do it, but it's making that judgment about when you do it, when you feel like you've got all the people in the right place to be able to make that happen. And simple things like we've had the carbon calculation training on our work plan for a year at least now, you know, and that's something we could and should do quite quickly. But not just with officers, but also with councillors. And it's probably fair to say we've got a broad band of people in terms of their views on climate, you know, so we have to deal with that too. But I think the local plan is a really significant piece of work, and that for me feels much stronger than it was. It's not perfect. It could be more robust in some areas, I think. But there's a lot of stuff in there that we don't have currently in our current plan. But the reality is that's you know, there's a national government issue in the mix there from a building regulation point of view needs to change. That would make all of our lives a lot easier, to be honest with you. You know, then it wouldn't be about what is nice to do. It would be you have to do it. Any more questions?
Oh, yes, Emmy again. Well,
Well,
you politely waited before jumping in with your
Yes,
second question, Emmy. Well done.
That's right. I definitely want other people to, but I did have a second one, and that, you know, thanks for explaining the cultural aspect. That was really, really important. That wider context, you know, when you're doing something like this, is so important. But my second question was just a more specific one. You know, quite interested about community energy projects and whether that's going to be in the mix.
There's definitely a very clear policy in the local plan document for it. One of the things that was on the document in that big busy slide in red is the local energy plan. There's now quite a lot of focus around local energy plans coming forward. And I went on a briefing yesterday, and I have to say that is a whole spider's web of a whole load of other complicated areas that we've got to get to grips with and get our heads around. And there was one council on there, again, I can't remember which council it was. It might have been Somerset again, who had taken a slightly different route because their view was to create this local area energy plan, LAEP, I think it's called, is an expensive exercise. And that's, again, a problem with councils like ours who are struggling with the, you know, the must-do services. But that, I think, is going to be something that will have to get a lot more focus and a lot more energy. And community energy should be part of that. But it's definitely very clearly referred to within one of the, I can't remember the planning reference in the local plan policy, but it's definitely in there for sure.
And I think again there are national obstacles to that, aren't there? I think Rupert knows very well because you've been in correspondence with Chris Heaton-Harris about it more than once. That there's a bill that's been trying to go through Parliament to make community energy projects just more practical and more viable, and it's been on the books for I don't know 5 years. And it's just taking ages. Everything just takes ages. Although I think I had an email today, which I only just briefly skimmed, which seemed to be some positive news on that front. But again, it seems to be more of an information gathering exercise and actually saying they're going to do something.
Yeah, the local electricity bill, I think that's the one.
Yeah, I think that's the one, yeah. John?
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks very much for that. We talked a bit about sort of councillors and different kind of views that they have and where they're at in their kind of views on climate change. I just wondered if you had any views on officers, and so people are actually working for the council, and how much commitment, genuine commitment, you think there is there, and how much work there is to do there on the education side?
I would say it's probably the same as you would find within the councillor community. You're going to find people who are more inclined to see this as an important and intrinsic DNA issue for the council. But you're probably also going to find people that are focusing on other issues and dealing with their budgets and all of those types of things. But again, it definitely is an education issue. I can't underestimate how much work still needs to be done on that front. And although we've got this net zero delivery group, quarterly, one might argue, meeting quarterly is probably not quite sufficient yet. But again, this is the way things operate within a council structure. Is you have to start the ball rolling with something, and then hopefully what you can eventually do is you can amplify that. So the sustainability group only met quarterly when it first started, and now we meet monthly, for instance. So I think it's a question of trying to just get some little fires burning. Probably not the right metaphor, but you know what I mean. And then trying to get those all to join up and spread eventually. But I think it would be fair to say, we've got something like 2,600 staff, something of that nature. So there are going to be very broad views in there. I think my hunch is that there's a lot of positive will about it, I think, but I suspect probably people are juggling the day-to-day workload, and that's why it then sort of sinks into the background a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes get the feeling that people have kind of lapsed into at that sort of officer level of a way of thinking of nothing will ever get done anyway, kind of thing. It's a sort of everything moves so slowly.
It does, and
nothing actually gets done.
And I can imagine from an officer's point of view that's frustrating. It certainly is from a councillor's point of view. But we have got some of these big delivery timelines. The local plan is got a deadline of around May 25. We've got the transport plan, which you'll be aware of as well. That's got an even sooner
very much so
delivery plan. So all of these issues, because they've got timelines, means we just need to keep the amplification and energy around it, really.
Yeah.
And at the same time, make sure that they all talk to each other and they all join up. And that's
something I came across this week for the last week for the first time is on the active travel front, is that Active Travel England, which I knew this, is now a statutory consultee on any large planning project. Yeah. And I saw that for the first time, I saw a response to a local, the plan for Northampton Station.
Okay. Yeah.
And the word scathing is not harsh enough. And then the plan was changed according to what they said, or not according to what they said, sort of a little bit. And they made more comments which were equally scathing, and which was marvelous to see, because I think these planning applications are I feel are an adversarial process. I think that's how they work, for good or for ill. And so to have a body, a really very highly professional body like Active Travel England, which is a government body, on the side of active travel is fantastic.
Yeah, I would agree. And the same thing can be said of the lead local flood authority, which of course is West Northants. And that area has been a bit of a gap. We've had low resource in that area. We still arguably don't have enough resource. One of the things that went to Cabinet on Tuesday, for instance, was a paper proposing new bylaws for flood and for stopping pollution in tributaries, with not major rivers because they fall under the Environment Agency, but for local rivers, drainage, and so on. And but what it very clearly said is we don't have the resource to do routine inspections. on those areas. So again, that's part of the challenge. Is you know, it's great. Let's bring those bylaws in, because actually very sensible, very logical thing to do. But you've got to make sure you do something with them fundamentally. You know.
Yeah.
But I think, John, the sad thing is that would be the story in any council, in any part of the land at the moment. You know, the resource issue is massive. Really.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Paul?
Yeah, hello everybody.
Hi, Paul.
Thanks, Jonathan, for the presentation. It was really interesting and really positive as well. I just wanted to follow on from the thought about officer level kind of awareness and engagement in this, and I kind of wanted to share a slightly different perspective based on my experience. So up until recently, I worked at Northamptonshire Partnership Homes as the sustainability manager.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And in that role, I worked closely with a wide variety of seniority in the organisation, from apprentices and officer levels all the way up to directors and chief executive, within within the council's housing management organisation, but also within the council itself.
Yeah.
I guess I kind of got a feeling that at officer level, actually, that there is quite a lot of enthusiasm at that level, and at apprentice level as well. And particularly from my experience, the people that really got involved in projects, I worked a lot on retrofit, and the people that came on board to work on the retrofit projects really saw the value of it and got really enthusiastic about it. And once they it's almost like they got the bug for it.
Yeah.
And it was so positive to see that, people that were quite skeptical coming into it really got it.
Yeah.
And I think from my experience, I've seen chief executives which have been really enthusiastic about the agenda, and I've met the leader of the council, and I know he's really enthusiastic. I've met Martin and his team a number of times, and I know they're really committed and ambitious. But to me, the challenge was the layer in between that.
Okay.
My experience was the kind of director level sandwich in between the top and the officer level.
Yeah.
My experience was that there was an apathy at that level for net zero. There's a feeling of it's not achievable, so why are we bothering?
Yeah.
That's the perspective that my experience was given.
Is that, Paul, is that sort of assistant director level then? Is that where you're talking, that type of
kind of level? Yeah. That sort of sandwich of senior executive level management. And I don't want to just say that as a criticism, because
sure.
I don't want to just be negative about it, but I can kind of understand why they feel that way, because they're under a lot of pressures from different priorities, and that someone said to me once that everything's a priority, and that makes it really challenging for that level. And I think one of the things that I really found interesting about your presentation was the idea of the sustainability working group being an influencer rather than a decision maker. And I was just kind of listening and thinking about, well, what's the real power of a group like that? What's the agency that you can do? And I think one of the slides talked about values and goals.
Yeah.
And I kind of like to think about net zero not really as a goal, but I think of it as a transformation. It's a transformation of how we do everything.
Yeah.
And I think when it's planted on people in senior positions as this is your goal, go and do it, it becomes like, well, that's bloody difficult. I have no idea how to do that, and it's impossible. So why are we bothering? China's not doing it, so why are we bothering?
Well, that phrase,
yeah. But if you think about and I think it relates very closely to the vision, because the vision is what you kind of think is your anchor to the future. It's what you're trying to achieve, or what you're transforming towards. And I think at the moment the vision is zero carbon by whatever, but zero carbon by 2045. And I think a lot of I feel like some of the senior decision makers are not bought into that vision, But I think if it could be swung, not swung, but kind of painted as a picture of transformation to a future that everybody wants, then it becomes more of a goal that is attainable. It's like it's desirable, rather than something that has been told to them to do.
Yeah.
And I know that's a very difficult thing to just do. I'm just saying, I'm just kind of thinking off the spot.
I think that's a fair point though, Paul. I think, you know, the decision, you know, we pushed very much the UK 100 2030 2045 goals actually, and I think in reality, in hindsight, they were signed up to because we put pressure on the council to do that, and they're good things to do, they're the right things to do, but I don't think they've really been thought through at that point. But what I'm encouraged about is I'm seeing some of the people that I might have thought would be tougher about agreeing or signing up to it, seeing opportunities through this now. So one of the things the council's working on is a solar project, for instance, for energy use for the council itself. And it's not fully formed yet. It's not there yet. It's not ready to go to cabinet and be signed off. But you know, when you've got the finance guy, who's the cabinet member for finance, going, actually, this is really good because it might be green, lovely, but this is going to save us money. You know, and I think that's the other thing that we don't talk about enough potentially. It's not just it's good for us. We don't necessarily talk about the opportunities where maybe there are savings to be made. You know, in your instance with retrofitting, for those people living in those homes, it's transformational for them, you know. So I think it's just getting better at telling those stories more. But you are right, it's in the midst of all of the other pressures that people are dealing with at an officer level, which for them probably often takes priority. That's the reality.
I think
we need to talk more, Paul, probably. So
yeah, okay.
well, I just think we probably need to have Paul back as a speaker, but anyway, we should worry about that later. And just to add to that, I think the other thing about sort of seeing those net zero dates too firmly as goals is that is not the end of the road. They're just stepping stones towards something else. You know, that it won't be job done when we reach net zero. Absolutely not.
I think you know, there is the understanding issue, and one of the things that I feel like we need to keep re-emphasizing is what net zero means, because some people still think it means, well, my hands are tied, I can't do anything then. It's like, no, it's net zero. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have some emissions still in the mix. You are, but it's about carefully looking across the balance of things. And if you're going to put some emissions in here, then you're going to have to compensate for it somewhere else. And I think that I was told that by one of the officers, that sometimes my name gets mentioned in dispatches about, you know, oh, Harris won't be happy about that because there's going to be emissions there, you know, and they don't understand necessarily that there probably will be, but it's about how you manage those collectively.
Thank you. And then so there's a question into the chat, which we'll probably try and make the last question because it's nearly 8:45. So Graham Robb asks, and I think this is a really good question, speaking as a parish councillor myself, how will the WNC strategy here translate to parish and town council level? I think that's a really important
it is
piece,
and actually this weighty document here doesn't specifically talk about parish councils, and arguably it should do, but I suspect the reason why it doesn't is because parish councils' powers in some of those 5 core pillars are probably not quite so obvious, but there is definitely a transport. Some parish councils have vehicles. I know Brixworth certainly does. Buildings, energy, waste, nature. You know, I think that's a job that we need to think about and we need to do, is how does that translate for parish councils fundamentally?
Yeah. I think that's really, you know, because certainly my parish council, I'm sure almost all parish councils will have an element of management of green spaces in their area. Which is somewhere they can definitely make a difference. It's somewhere actually to try and engage local populations to understand climate change and net zero. It's a really good starting point because it's something that most people can get their heads around. Most people are quite keen on the idea that having more trees and more flowers might be a good thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that definitely needs to happen. Does anyone have any more burning questions for Jonathan? Think about it for a second while I just say thank you ever so much for coming and having the talk. I know you're struggling with your voice, so thank you even more because of that.
No problem.
You managed not to choke, so that's really
I managed
good.
not to choke, which is a good step. Yeah, that helps. So just to re-emphasize to everybody, the slides will be available. There will be meeting notes, and obviously the meeting recording will go up on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So plenty of opportunities to look back at them and reflect. I think certainly the slides will be worth reading through. There was a lot in there that we probably need to look at in more detail. So thank you, Jonathan, very much indeed. No problem.
Really appreciate that.
Thank you for having me, and I hope it's helpful. If anybody wants to
Very helpful, yeah.
then please just contact me. That's not a problem.
Thank you. So I have a couple of other things just to try and cover in the last few minutes of the meeting. The most important of those from my perspective is that we've got a social get-together at Northampton Museum and Art Gallery on Saturday afternoon. We had one of these back in January, which I personally felt was unexpectedly successful. We had about 25 people turned up, and I think, you know, lots of people met people they hadn't met before, found they had lots in common, lots to talk about. That was really nice. So open to anybody to come along. We'll be there from 2 o'clock till probably around about 4 in the downstairs area of the cafe at the museum, if you're familiar with it, and if you're not, I'm sure it's easy enough to find your way there. What we, as well as, and it's completely informal, no agenda, no need to stay as long as they need you, pop in for 10 minutes or stay for ages, absolutely up to you. The only thing that we are doing, as well as just allowing people the chance to meet face to face, which is simply nice, is that we are, as you will have seen from my email this morning, hopefully, launching the Corn Lending Library, because we've been very generously gifted a large number of good books on environmental and climate themes, which we're keen to sort of share out, really, because there's I think there's about 90 books. It will take me probably most of the, well, it's a long time to get to all those if I kept them all to myself. So we're going to share them out. So if people want to borrow books, there is a list on our website. I sent a link to it out this morning. So another incentive to come along on Saturday if you are available and free. The other thing I wanted to mention, this is just, I sort of did speak about it earlier on in terms of the West Northamptonshire Council consultations. There seems to be a bit of consultation season going on at the moment, because there's one on flood management and one on local plan, both of which we're going to aim to get some notes out on in the next week or so. And there is one on the station, which John Crick mentioned, and Living Streets have put together some notes on that for people, so we'll be sending out a link to that as well. That one is much more imminent than the others. The local plan and the flood management one don't finish till June, but the station consultation finishes, I think, on the 29th of April, so I'll try and get that out fairly soon so people can have a look at that. It really is important to try and respond to these things. As Jonathan said, even if it's just a question of, you know, you don't have time to plough through the whole questionnaire. A lot of the questions in the questionnaires are often quite irrelevant anyway, or can seem that way. So if there's just an issue that you really care about, just send in an email. It's so important that the council gets to hear from people, gets to know what people care about, and gets to know that people are actually looking at what's happening, you know. So yeah, please do think about that. There was one other thing. Did you want to talk about that thing that you emailed me about today, Harry? I think I've got a note of, I've got trust the people.
Yes, I don't have it in front of me, Jane. Do you have it in front of you?
I probably have got your email somewhere. Let me have a quick look.
This was an invitation to join a 4-week workshop with a group called Trust the People, which personally I've not come across. I don't know if anyone else has heard of Trust the People. But they've got a manifesto. Jane, can you read it out?
I can, yeah. So so I didn't realise that was quite, didn't pick up on that. But anyway, so Trust the People is a grassroots community building movement sharing democratic tools to help people support their communities in the face of local and global crises. Trust the People are offering a free 4-week online course that takes you through different aspects of community building, from connecting with people one-to-one to running community assemblies, which harness the wisdom and power of the community. Their next course begins on Monday, the 29th of April. which I think is about 10 days away, isn't it? And so it does sound interesting. Yeah, perhaps worth looking at. And we can send out some details of that if people are interested.
Just quickly say, Climate Centre for Alternative Technology are doing a similar thing. I'll try and send you the information, Jane.
Oh yes, thank you. That would be really helpful. What we aim to try and do, and probably the best place for things like that is put them on our What's On page, so that it then, you know, we just have sort of a calendar there of things that are happening locally and more widely where they're of interest to people. Let me just go back to my notes. I didn't have anything else that I wanted to mention other than that our next meeting is actually a bit of a departure from our normal schedule. So normally we have our meetings on the 3rd Thursday of every month. This one is actually going to be on the last Thursday of May. Our guest speaker for that is Damon Fox, who, I'm not sure if this is entirely the right title, but he essentially covers what he does. He's a sustainability manager for Northampton Town Community Trust. And they've been doing a huge amount of really surprisingly amazing things at the football club to help drive sustainability. So I think it'll be a really interesting meeting. Damon is a very lively person who is a very interesting and entertaining speaker, so I think it'll be a good meeting. And actually, Jonathan mentioned that we'll be hearing about the tree strategy. I think that the tree strategy will be hearing from Russell Horsey, who is the consultant who is working on the tree strategy and policy with the council. I think that is in the next meeting, which is June. But again, something I'm really looking forward to because it's such an important thing to get done. And I think it's in very good hands with him. I think we'll learn a lot from that meeting as well. We actually have 10 minutes spare at the end of this meeting, which is almost unheard of. Is there anything else that anybody would like to say before we wrap up and let people go away? Oh, John, yes.
Yeah, just thank you for mentioning the Northampton Station stuff, Jane. I know you're going to forward to the group.
Yeah.
I just wanted to emphasise on that the fact that not many people respond to these consultations, and in the first round on the Northampton Station consultation, there were maybe a dozen or two responses, and many of them were about the active travel implications for it, because they haven't properly thought that through at all. And as a result, we did see changes made.
Good.
But Active Travel England came back and said these changes aren't enough, which is true. They're not enough. More needs to be done. And the other thing to mention about it is that it is, as you said, only an email to respond to the consultation, and we've summed up everything on the Living Streets website on the address that you're going to send. Because if you go onto the consultation page itself, first of all, it gives you a wrong end date for the consultation.
Great.
But also there's like 100 documents to wade through, including exactly where all the sewers are and things like that, for example, under the site. So and none of these documents are meaningfully named. So it's, if you were cynical, you might even say that the system is set up to deliberately confuse and make it really difficult to take part in the consultation. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but that's certainly the feeling you get as an individual going on and looking at all these documents. It took me 4 or 5 hours to sort of narrow down the important documents and distill them and work out what was going on.
Yes. And you've got a good background in that sort of stuff. You can just imagine as a fairly average member of the public with lots of other things to do.
Yeah.
It's really unrealistic to expect people to be able to put the time and effort into that and make sense of it in a lot of cases. It's the same with the local plan, isn't it? It's, you know, it's a huge document, which I understand why it's massive and why it's complicated, but it feels as there's got to be a better way of giving people a feel for it so that they know what they're looking at.
Yeah, very often on the consultations as well, if you go through the kind of questions that are asked, if you go through that way of doing it rather than sending an email, then they're all kind of leading questions. You know, it's all geared to sort of how it's wanted to be answered, isn't it?
Well, what they tend to be doing is asking for feedback on the proposal that they've put forward, which then doesn't give you the opportunity to say, well, yes, okay, that's fine, but what about this? It makes it very difficult to squeeze in those sorts of comments.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, if you want to say, I don't like the proposal at all, and it's not properly thought through in that way. But as I say, it was fantastic to see the Active Travel England response. It was really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's very encouraging to know.
Yeah.
Emmy?
Hi, yeah. Sort of coming back to the sort of council role and stuff a bit. So I run a climate group in my village, and it's seen as very fringe. We do a lot of biodiversity work as well, but it really helped having West Northants Council send down a kind of directive to the parish councils to do a biodiversity plan. My parish council, as I say, regards us as a little bit sort of, you know, fringe, bonkers, whatever. And I would love something like that come down about climate. I don't think they've ever thought of declaring a climate emergency. I can't even imagine it. But, you know, I would really like something. They really take it seriously when it comes from you guys at WNC. And I'd love to, they're gradually beginning to take me seriously, especially because I wrote their biodiversity policy, thanks to help from Jane as well, and plan. And it's that really helped to give validation.
Can I just mention, Jane, in the chat, Christine's mentioned, slightly biased. For those who don't know, Christine, who's on the call, is the half as well. But she is also on Brixworth Parish Council. And Brixworth Parish Council did declare a climate emergency, actually. They managed to get a motion through. And they've now got a green framework, which she mentions in the chat, which is on the website. So it can be done. But I mean, I've got a very broad range of parishes in my ward, and some of them, this stuff isn't really anywhere near on their radar yet.
Well, I was told the other day, so we had a parish council meeting on Monday. We always do an update on, you know, what our environmental working group is up to. And the chair of our parish council is also the West Northants Councillor for Long Buckby Ward. And he said of all the parish council meetings that he attends, Bugbrook is far ahead in terms of sort of biodiversity and climate and things like that. And actually, I didn't think we'd done very much. So that's a bit of a worry. And the other thing I'd point out is that the biodiversity plan is a new regulation. It isn't an initiative necessarily by the council specifically. And I don't think there is a similar regulation for climate change, which means they're less likely to pick that up, unfortunately. But I totally agree. They need some direction. You know, parish councils tend to be a little bit sticky in the mud. But the other thing I would say, as a parish councillor who has tried, and you know, it has been difficult, and I feel like we haven't done it well enough, and we've got lots more to do, but I've tried hard to push a climate agenda. I have felt in some respects as if the resistance from other councillors was much less than I expected. Many of them are not getting actively involved, but they're not actively pushing back either. And I'm sure that's not because I'm that much of a bully that they're scared to say. At least I hope not. Anyway, Rupert.
Yes, just going back on the attitude of people to biodiversity planning and climate change. And we had our meeting the other day on biodiversity, and somebody's put it round describing it as Rupert's gig.
Oh dear. This is the truth. I have to say, it's you have to be very careful not to be perceived as the person that does everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
bit cheeky, I thought.
Very cheeky.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. I'm always very clear about saying people sometimes have great ideas, but I love great ideas, but they can't be presents for me.
No. So exactly.
Yes.
Well done, you.
And
yeah.
I think I shall ignore it. I won't react to it.
No. Anyway, so I think we'll say thank you all very much indeed for attending. I hope you found it as interesting a meeting as I did. Really appreciate everybody's time this evening, and hope to catch up with at least some of you on Saturday, and if not, perhaps next month's meeting on, as I said, the 30th of May. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Jonathan.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.